Nightreign has to be the one game that I have the most complicated love-hate relationship with. And this is coming from someone with over 900 hours in Overwatch. On one hand, it's very fun. Each of the Nightfarers feels incredibly distinct and are really fun to play. Relics do a lot for build variety. You get to use the whole breadth of Elden Ring's unique weapons in Ash of Wars, and it is immensely satisfying when a good run comes together and you can physically see the impact of every part involved. On the other hand, it can be a frustrating mess of 40-minute runbacks, questionable randomness, and a whole slew of ways the game will waste your precious time. However, I do need to preface this review with the fact that I play solo almost exclusively, and I know this colors my perspective, as trios will have more tools to mitigate or even outright circumvent the issues I'll speak about, and I know the game is designed from the ground up for cooperative play, but for the significant portion of the player base who queues in alone, these problems are amplified. I want to start with what is arguably my hottest take, and it's a problem that I don't really see there being an easy solution for, if any at all. But it's that Nightreign is a game that is fundamentally at odds with the subgenre it belongs to. What I mean by this is that Souls games are characterized by their very careful and more deliberate combat, where attacks are very committal and can often have long recovery times. Boss fights in Souls games are designed around a sort of call and response style of gameplay, where the boss tends to dictate the pace of the fight. They do an attack, you dodge and punish. It's almost turn-based in nature. If you attack out of turn, then you will most likely get punished. This fundamentally conflicts with Nightreign structure because good runs are predicated on your ability to kill bosses in a timely manner, but you often do not control, or you have very limited control over the pace of a fight, unless you're playing characters like Iron Eye or Executor, who can punch well above their weight and don't necessarily play by the same rules as everybody else. And a lot of bosses either themselves waste a ton of time, like Black Knife Assassin, Red Wolf, Flying Dragon, or Ulcerated Tree Spirit, or they have attacks or phase transitions that waste a lot of time, like Magma Worm, Ancient Hero Zamor, Ancestor Spirit, and Erdtree Avatar. These are not issues in and of themselves in regular Elden Ring where you're not pressed for time, but in Nightreign every second matters, and these bosses specifically, while often trivial health-wise, they clash with the core concepts. And sure, there are ways around this. I mean, ultimates are a really good way of canceling attacks that waste time, but you'll often only get one per fight or already enter a fight without one. The point is that you won't be able to cancel all of them every time they appear, no matter what. And bosses can choose to repeatedly do time-wasting attacks or attacks that are unpunishable depending on your weapon type, which feels really bad in a timed mode. I know that regardless of this, it's not impossible to win. In fact, it's very possible to win consistently, even on Deep of Night, where these time-wasting bosses can be enhanced with considerably more health and thus take even longer to kill than before. So maybe I'm alone in feeling this way about the game's design, but it's something that's bugged me and I wanted to point it out. You have a game rooted in deliberate turn-based combat, but its core loop demands speed and aggression. This isn't an insurmountable obstacle, but it's a constant underlying friction that makes every run feel like you're fighting against the game's own nature. Another thing I want to point out is the lack of variety in night bosses and the map layout. For one, I see no reason why night bosses should be seeded to the expedition target themselves. Maybe for regular expeditions, that's fine, since it could be a good way for players to be able to somewhat consistently practice night bosses that they might be struggling with. But to extend that into Deep of Night contributes to the game feeling stale. Imagine how cool it would be to have a run where, through sheer randomness, you got only, say, Dark Souls 1 bosses, or maybe your Night 1 boss was Demon in Pain and Demon from Below, but on Night 2 you got a different boss entirely. Being unable to predict what comes next and being surprised is what keeps roguelikes interesting. Once you know your target, you know who to expect. And if your target is hidden, you know who you got just by the first wave of enemies on night 1, which makes that modifier less impactful. What's supposed to be an interesting and more varied endgame mode for experienced players just becomes more of the same. And while depth relics and unique weapons and demerits and mixed POIs do help to shake up the experience, they should have taken that one extra step to make Deep of Night feel even more interesting. But I'll talk more about Deep of Night in a bit. The map variety is another area that needs more work, and I do appreciate that Deep of Night mixes DLC points of interest with vanilla ones, and even on non-DLC targets. But if we're not going to get any new major content like new Night Lords or DLC, then I think the least they could do is dedicate some time to developing new POI variants or new points of interest altogether to occasionally drop anything to show us that the game is still supported and that we haven't been abandoned. And on the topic of points of interest, I think they absolutely should not have made the new ones DLC exclusive. And I'll even take it a step further and say that they shouldn't have even made the Balancers and the Dreglord DLC exclusive. Here's my reasoning. For one, you're effectively fragmenting the community into two camps, those who own the DLC and those who don't. This is almost never a good thing for the longevity of any online multiplayer game. Those without will only ever queue into the same vanilla content, but now those with the DLC are queuing into a smaller and more exclusive portion of the community. And in Deep of Night, where structures and shifting earths are no longer exclusive, if you get one person on your team that doesn't own the DLC, then you're not going to get to see DLC content for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Now, is this a death sentence for the game? No, definitely not. But it's a short-sighted design choice that creates unnecessary friction and could become a bigger problem down the line. It's a high-risk, low-reward gamble that, so far, hasn't had any overtly detrimental effects on the player base, but that doesn't make the underlying design any less worrying. The next thing I want to talk about is Deep of Night, and this is another topic where there may not be proper reconciliation for my specific issues with it, so take this with a grain of salt, I suppose. For one, I love what Deep of Night does for the game. Having more relic slots is incredibly liberating, especially with the addition of some brand new Nightfarer specific effects that are exclusive to them. And unique weapons that can be found during a run are also a great addition, incentivizing experimentation, risk-taking, and really amplifying a given playstyle if you're lucky. However, I do not agree with the idea that making the game more difficult means making enemies hit harder and have more health. That to me is the laziest form of balancing there is. In a game where you're already hard pressed for time, making it take even longer to kill things seems counterintuitive. Obviously, with depth relics, you can get some ridiculous damage numbers out, but I'll go more into relics in a bit. This is another instance where I feel Nightreign backed itself into a corner. How do you make a Souls game more difficult? What even makes a Souls game difficult in the first place? To me, the difficulty of these games are in the first encounters with a boss or enemy type, where you have no knowledge of their moveset or punish windows, and that lack of knowledge gets you punished until, through repeated attempts, you learn and internalize the moveset and essentially pass the knowledge checks. That's really all these games are, knowledge checks. You can go on YouTube and watch a boss guide explain all the attack chains and attack variations and how to dodge each of them and what the optimal punishes are. Shout out Chris Crass, your guides are the best. With one video, you're already at least 60% of the way there. You now know what to look out for. It might still take you a number of attempts, but you've expedited the learning process by an order of magnitude. Once you've perfected a boss fight, does narrowing the margin of error by increasing the damage really make the fight any harder? I think this is why the game's never really had a difficulty option to begin with. It can only ever be more or less forgiving. Deep of Night doesn't add any new knowledge checks. It just tightens the margin for error, which feels lazier and less engaging than the core design philosophy would suggest. Ideally, it would switch up parts of a boss's moveset or add new attacks entirely. And yes, that requires a lot more work. But if the goal is to create a challenge that aligns with the design principles of the subgenre, then I feel that work becomes necessary. It's why I think people complain so much about Sekiro, because Sekiro takes the knowledge check-based nature of FromSoft games and turns it up to 11. The faster you can learn and internalize attack timings and combos, the easier time you will have. And it's the same reason Elden Ring's delayed attacks were so effective at throwing off veteran players who've developed an intuitive sense for the timing of telegraphed attacks. These games are not traditionally hard. They require an accumulation of knowledge and punish the lack thereof. This is a bit of a tangent, but this is also why I believe that whole get good thing started and gained so much traction, because the only barrier to getting good is just having more knowledge, which is a low barrier, all things considered. It becomes easy to feel a sense of superiority when you know something another person doesn't. You're in the loop and they're not. When the bar is so low, it tends to attract those kinds of insufferable personalities. You don't really see this level of elitism in like character action games, for example, where there's an actual mechanical barrier as well as a knowledge barrier. The last thing I want to talk about are the relics. And I think the relics need some kind of overhaul or some way to influence what we actually get on them. They are great for crafting new kinds of builds and interesting playstyles, but that's entirely predicated on luck, and there's too many useless effects that dilute the pool. Relics are the backbone of this game. They are your reward for expeditions, your reason for doing them, your engine for new playstyles, and when you've bought all the gestures, goblets, and fixed relics, the relic slot machine is the only money sink left. It would be nice if players could spend merc to maybe re-roll the color of a relic or re-roll one or more effects on a relic as, say, a one-time purchase for that relic. Maybe there could be randomized challenges each player receives during a run, like doing damage with a certain weapon type, or killing a certain number of field bosses, or dying less than X number of times, or using X number of consumables, etc. This can further aid in creating variety between runs by informing decisions players may not have otherwise made, and encourages engaging with more aspects of the game. And upon completion, maybe you receive a currency made solely for re-rolling relic aspects. Personally, I'm against the idea of games having too many distinct currencies, but at this point, I would take almost anything over what we have now. This isn't to say that I want these exact ideas implemented exactly as I described. I'm really just spitballing ideas here with the intent to start a dialogue. Maybe these ideas are actually terrible as is, but might help inspire a much more well rounded idea with potentially better implementation. All too often, I've seen relics with one or two really good effects for a character, but ruined by a second and or third effect that is just utterly useless or belongs to a color that I can't use because that character's selection of goblets won't accommodate it with other equally fitting relics. If relics and merc are the primary incentive for completing expeditions, then the slot machine only serves as a mechanism to get the relic rewards without having to complete an entire run. This is another one of the game's core issues. Once you have your perfect relics, what reason do you have to keep playing? Obviously, there will be the intrinsic motivation to play. You play because it's fun, or you play to test out different builds. However, I don't think the developers intended to rely on intrinsic motivation. Otherwise, there may not have been a reward system to begin with. And if intrinsic motivation were on the minds of the developers, then I think they would have added some system, some other money sink to influence or change parts of a relic you already have. It's my belief that the developers believed the relic system as is, grindy and tedious as it is, would be all the extrinsic motivation players would need to continue playing. And I think they were wrong. Much of the dialogue surrounding Depth 5 trios are about how people are cheating in the most optimal and meta relics, or even relics with an impossible combination of effects. Any game with the potential to negate a great investment of time and render it a waste becomes a breeding ground for cheaters, and many people would consider it a waste to spend 40 minutes only to get mediocre and unusable relics as a reward, and then spend accumulated merc across multiple runs to get 10 or more random useless relics. You can sell relics for merc, yes, but that only gives you more spins on the slot machine, which, sure, will increase your odds of getting desirable relics over time, but it doesn't change the fact that the system is grindy and frustrating at its core. This loosely ties back to the theme of wasting time from earlier. The relic system is the ultimate expression of that problem. You spend 40 minutes for a reward that is likely useless, forcing you to grind more merc to spin a slot machine that will also likely waste your time. Despite my pain points with the game, I still love it to death. I've already put more time in it than regular Elden Ring. I feel it's so close to being a perfect game, and that's why I think this critique is worth making. When it clicks and everything comes together, it is such an incredibly satisfying experience. So, in conclusion, I feel Nightreign is a game caught between two diametrically opposed ideas. It wants to be a fast-paced action roguelike, but it's built on the foundation of a more methodical and deliberate RPG. And until that conflict is addressed, whether by embracing the speed or by rethinking what difficulty means in a timed environment, it will feel less like a bold new experiment and more like a frustrating, if occasionally brilliant, compromise. Anyways, that's about all I have to say on the matter. I think I'm done with Nightreign for now. I had my fun with it, and I definitely don't regret it, but if FromSoft is done with the game, then so am I. What do you guys think of the game? Do you agree or disagree with any of the points that I've made? Maybe you have a fresh and interesting perspective on the matter? Let me know. I'd love to continue the discussion in the comments. Thanks for listening to me ramble, and enjoy the rest of the run.